Hello everybody, welcome back to the Brothers Grimdark, where today we're going to be talking a little bit more about tyranids, my favorite big nasty bugs that like to eat everything. It's our unit focus today, so I'm going to be talking about my Neurothrope. He's one of my favorite units in my army for a couple of reasons. One, I definitely go with that sort of very alien thing for my tyrannid, so I like having a big brain bug kind of orchestrating everything from the back, and he fits that role perfectly. He's also one of my favorite conversions I've done for my nids so far. I really wanted to make him stand out a little bit from the rest of the Zonethropes. Like the standard model's kind of got like the slightly bigger head, but otherwise he looks kind of similar to everything else. So I really wanted him to stand out. And I also wanted him to look even more horror-esque than they do already. So I don't remember where the idea came from. Maybe it was like the whole bugs coming out the walls thing. But I decided to have this idea of him morphing through a wall. With then all of these other weird tentacles and claws and things kind of coming through him, like sort of through the warp and through his psychic abilities. So really amping up that kind of horror element that's not just him, it's everything that comes along with him through his abilities. And then, yeah, him orchestrating everything. So really happy with the model. I think he like stands out quite nicely from the other models in my army. He's a nice little centerpiece, even though he's not like enormous compared to some of the other big tyrannid monsters. And he's really a staple for me. You know, in almost every game, he's my warlord. I think he's super powerful in the game right now. He's really good at just kind of hanging out behind everything and orchestrating from the back of the battle, which fits the theme that he's going for. And he's just really, really useful compared to everything else. He has his own little buddies, the Zonethropes, which are floating around him. So I like to think of them as like the sort of Neurothropes in waiting that he's training up, and one day they might evolve enough to take his place. But for right now, he's the head honcho in charge of everything. And they go out and do his bidding and protect him while he's out there. Rules-wise, his stat line's not super impressive, to be honest. I mean, but it doesn't really have to be. He's got a 6-inch movement, weapon skill 5, ballistic skill 3, but he's not going to be fighting anything or shooting things unless things have gone very wrong. Strength 5, toughness 5 is kind of handy, and he's got 6 wounds. So he's actually relatively tough for a big floating brain. 2 attacks, who cares? Leadership 10. 5-up save, but here's the kicker. He has a 3-up invul. There are not many things in the game left that have a 3+ invul save. So with that toughness 5 and 6 wounds, even if he is kind of hanging out by himself, he's not the easiest thing to kill. And with so many other threats kind of running around in your army, he tends to get ignored even though he's really, really powerful. So decent stat line, but it's really that toughness, that 3-up save, and those wounds make him pretty beefy actually for, you know, a little character floating about. He of course has Synapse and Shadow in the Warp, as you would expect. He's got that 3-up invul. He has a rule which I don't think has ever come up in one of my games yet, which is anytime you do mortal wounds in the psychic phase, he can heal up some Zonethropes around him. I tend to find that my Zonethropes are either already dead or they're on their full wounds. Like, usually they get targeted really, really heavily, or they've been ignored up until that point, or I've kept them out of trouble. So it seems like a really, really cool rule. I'm sure it will come in handy at some point, but it hasn't actually come up all that often in games for me. But cool rules are cool. We're happy with that. He's also an incredibly reliable psyker. He gets +1 to all of his psychic tests, and his sort of buffing ability is he can add an extra d6 to himself or a Zonethrope unit around him. Or I think it's just any psyker unit. Yeah, any psyker unit. So he is very reliable himself, and he can make another unit even more reliable. So very, very powerful psychic abilities and very reliable psychic abilities. He doesn't have a whole lot of options that you can give him, but because I tend to run him as my warlord, he usually gets a warlord trait and a relic. The warlord trait I tend to run him with is just kind of a standard tyrannid one. It's not really a Zonethrope thing, but I almost always run direct guidance just because I think it's incredibly useful. It gives 1 unit +1 to their hit rolls, which just with the amount of combat in my army, very, very handy to kind of have that. And in terms of relics, even though he's already a powerful psyker, I almost always give him the resonance barb as well. So that gives him an additional +1 to cast on his psychic powers, and he gets to know an additional psychic power. That may seem like overkill, but the reason I kind of do this is I tend to run the Zoanthrope, 2 units of Zoanthropes and the Neurothrope as my main psychers in my army. Occasionally I've got a Broodlord. I tend not to take the Hive Tyrant so much these days because of that thing where he has to be your Warlord, and if your Warlord dies, then you lose your Synaptic Imperatives, which I think is a bit of a shame. So in terms of psychers, I tend to just have the Neurothrope and the Zoanthropes, and the Zoanthropes are really just there throwing out smites. So even though I've got a ton of like psychers on the table, the Neurothrope is actually the only one who casts a bunch of psychic powers. So him knowing 1 extra one and being able to cast 2 and then being +2 to his casts is actually really, really nice. So that tends to be what I stack him up with. He's got the Resonance Barb for himself, and he's got the Direct Guidance Warlord trait to buff up a unit that I think are going to need it in combat that turn. In terms of psychic powers, there are a lot to pick from. They're all really good. It depends a little bit who you're up against and what you kind of want to do with them. Like Onslaught's always a classic, really good to have that advance and charge, especially when it's going to be going off very reliably. With your Neurothrope, you can almost guarantee you're going to get that advance and charge off, which is good because otherwise you advance the unit, you fail that psychic power, they're just stranded out there. So it's good having it on a very reliable psyker. The Neuroparasite, I think, is actually a really handy aggressive one for him, especially if you're going up against like toughness 3 units. I find it quite nice for taking out Guardians in Lyndon's army, but also Tau, Guard, things like that. It's really, really powerful, especially because it's one that can be cast through Synaptic Link range. So even though my Neurothrope is sitting at the back of the table most games, I can usually bounce his psychic powers through Zoanthropes, and I have a lot of Warriors, so I have a lot of Synapse on the table. So even though he's all the way at the back of the table, I can be targeting units on the front line because of that Synaptic Link ability. So really, really powerful, especially for things like Neuroparasite. And Catalyst is, again, another classic one. So those are the 3 I tend to take. Being able to give one of your units a 5-up shrug just makes them a lot more tanky, especially since most things in NIDS are not super strong defensive-wise. So having that extra 5-up shrug, really, really handy to have. The only, I think, weakness really of the Neurothrope is I don't love his Synaptic Imperative all that much. It's okay, it gives all your Psychers +1 to cast and gives you a shrug against mortal wounds. So if you're coming up against another very psychic-heavy army, could be more useful. But for the most part, that tends to be one I save to the end of the game when it's not all that useful and I've got a couple of Psychers left to give them a little bit of a buff. But it's not one I tend to build my game around so much. But overall, he's an awesome unit. He makes everything around him better. He can heal up Zoanthropes. He can cast psychic powers across the table. He can hold backfield objectives by himself. He's reasonably tough for just a single character. So as long as he's protected a little bit, he's going to be fine for most of the games. I think in almost every game I've played, he's almost always the last model on the board for me because you have to deal with everything else I've got out there. So he's a lot of fun. I think he fits the theme of my army really well, and he's super powerful. He's 100 points, which is pretty reasonable, I think, for everything you get of him. For, like I said, like his stat line's not going to blow anybody away. He's not going to do all that much damage with his, his stats, but the sheer amount of psychic power output that he gets and his buffing abilities for everyone around him. And I think with that kind of nerf that the Tyranids got, where if your Warlord dies, you lose your Synaptic Imperatives, having a more defensive Warlord is not the worst thing in the world right now. So having him at the back of the table, kind of orchestrating everything while the other bugs are out there causing lots of terror, is how I tend to run things, and I think he's a fantastic character for that. But anyway, that's my Neurothrope. As I said, he's the go-to HQ choice for my army. As I said, I actually find it, there's tons and tons of Tyranid HQs, and they're very easy to put in your army with all the special rules that they've got. Like when you take a unit of warriors, you can add a prime, for example, without them taking the HQ slot. But I actually find the HQs a little bit tricky to fill in with Tyranids sometimes. But the Neurothrope is pretty much always there. Let me know what you've been running for your HQs. I know that the Hive Tyrant with wings is always still popular just because he's very mobile and does a ton of damage output, but I do worry about losing that Synaptic Imperative sometimes. But yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if you've had horror stories running into Neurothropes yourself. And that's it for today. We'll catch you next time with another unit focus on the Brothers Grimdark.